You ever look at old wedding photos and wonder when exactly the people in them stopped being who they promised to be? Jennifer and David Whitmore said their vows on a perfect June afternoon in 2009, surrounded by 200 guests who believed every word they spoke. For better or worse, in sickness and health, till death do us part. The words felt permanent, carved in stone, an unbreakable covenant. "16 years later, they'd realized those vows might as well have been written in vanishing ink, beautiful and meaningful when first inscribed, but fading a little more each day until nothing remained but the ghost of what they'd promised. This isn't a story about infidelity or dramatic betrayal. It's something more common and somehow sadder. The slow dissolution of commitment, the gradual abandonment of promises that both people made in absolute sincerity, believing they'd be the exception to every divorce statistic they'd ever heard. Jennifer was 27 when she married David, a year out of law school and just starting at a firm in Boston. David was 29, working as an architect at a prestigious company downtown. They'd met through mutual friends, dated for 3 years, moved in together for one more before David proposed on a beach in Maine. Their relationship had been easy, comfortable. They laughed at the same jokes, wanted the same things: career success, eventual children, a house in the suburbs, a life that looked like their parents' lives but maybe slightly better. The wedding was everything Jennifer had dreamed of since childhood. Her mother had helped plan it. Her 3 sisters served as bridesmaids. Her father cried walking her down the aisle. David's best man gave a speech about how David had finally found someone who could tolerate his terrible puns and obsessive organization. Jennifer's maid of honor talked about how she'd never seen Jennifer happier, how David brought out the best in her. Everyone meant what they said. Everyone believed this marriage would last forever. The vows they wrote themselves were specific, personal. Jennifer promised to support David's dreams even when they scared her. David promised to make Jennifer laugh every day, to be her safe place when the world felt overwhelming. Jennifer promised patience with David's workaholic tendencies. David promised to prioritize their relationship over his career. They both promised honesty, fidelity, partnership. They promised to choose each other, every day, no matter what challenges came. And in that moment, backlit by afternoon sun streaming through church windows, they believed every word. The first year was good. They were newlyweds in a small apartment, still discovering each other's habits, still finding romance in mundane domesticity. David would leave notes in Jennifer's briefcase. Jennifer would cook David's favorite meals after long workdays. They had game nights and movie marathons, took weekend trips to Vermont, talked about their future with excited certainty. They were building something, they told themselves. Something lasting. The cracks started showing in year 2, though neither recognized them as cracks at the time. David got promoted, which meant longer hours and more travel. Jennifer understood. They'd talked about career sacrifices, about supporting each other's ambitions. But understanding intellectually and living with constant absence were different things. Jennifer found herself eating dinner alone most nights, going to bed before David got home, waking to find him already gone to the office. "I'm building our future," David would say when Jennifer mentioned feeling lonely. "A few years of this and we'll be set financially. Then I can pull back." It was reasonable. It was what they'd discussed. But Jennifer started noticing that David's promises to be home for dinner were made and broken with increasing frequency. The notes stopped appearing in her briefcase. The laughter became rare, reserved for when David wasn't too tired or stressed. Jennifer threw herself into her own work, making partner track at her law firm by 29. Now they were both working 70-hour weeks, ships passing in their own home. They'd sit together on weekends, both on laptops, claiming they were spending time together while actually working in proximity. The intimacy that had defined their early relationship evaporated, replaced by logistical coordination and efficient division of household tasks. Year 4 brought discussions about children. Jennifer wanted to start trying, was worried about her biological clock. David wanted to wait until his next promotion, until they'd saved more money, until the timing was perfect. They fought about it, the first real fights of their marriage. Jennifer accused David of prioritizing career over family. David accused Jennifer of not appreciating his efforts to provide stability. Both had valid points. Both felt unheard. They compromised by agreeing to table the discussion for a year. But that year came and went, and David still wasn't ready. Then another year. Jennifer watched her friends have babies, felt the ache of unfulfilled maternal longing. David felt the pressure of Jennifer's resentment, which made him more anxious about the responsibility of parenthood, which made him even less ready. They were stuck in a feedback loop neither knew how to escape. By year 7, they'd mastered the art of living parallel lives. Jennifer had her work friends, her book club, her yoga class. David had his project teams, his running group, his architecture conferences. They attended social events together, performed happiness for others, then retreated to their separate corners at home. Sex became rare, functional when it happened, lacking the connection that had made it meaningful before. Jennifer's sister asked once if she was happy. "I'm fine," Jennifer said automatically. "Marriage is work, right? This is just what long-term commitment looks like." She believed it too, or tried to. Maybe everyone's marriage cooled after the honeymoon period. Maybe intimacy always gave way to comfortable companionship. Maybe this was normal, and she was naive for expecting more. David told his best friend the same thing when asked. "We're solid," he said. "Just busy." "Once things settle down at work, we'll reconnect." But things never settled down. There was always another project, another deadline, another reason to postpone quality time. The promises David made to himself about prioritizing Jennifer evaporated under the constant pressure of professional ambition. Year 9 brought a health scare. Jennifer found a lump, spent 3 weeks in terror waiting for biopsy results. David was supportive, went to appointments, held her hand through the anxiety. The lump was benign, but the scare shifted something in Jennifer. Life was short. She was spending hers in a marriage that looked good on paper but felt hollow in practice. She'd promised David in sickness and health, but she realized he'd only shown up for the sickness. The daily health of their relationship had been neglected for years. She suggested couples therapy. David was resistant, said they didn't need it, that they just needed to make more time for each other. Jennifer pushed, and David eventually agreed to go. The therapist asked them each to describe their marriage. Jennifer talked about loneliness, feeling like roommates rather than partners. David talked about feeling unappreciated, like his efforts to provide financially meant nothing to Jennifer. The therapist pointed out they'd been having the same circular argument for years without resolution. "What happened to the people who made those vows?" the therapist asked. Jennifer and David looked at each other across the therapy office and couldn't answer. Those people, the 27 and 29-year-olds full of hope and certainty, had been replaced by 36 and 38-year-olds full of resentment and disappointment. The promises they'd made felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Therapy helped them communicate better, but couldn't create desire that had atrophied from neglect. They learned to fight more productively, to express needs more clearly. But learning skills didn't address the fundamental problem. They'd grown into people who wanted different things, who'd built separate lives that happened to share an address. The love was still there, buried under years of disappointment, but neither knew if it was enough to rebuild on. Year 12 brought David's biggest promotion yet, the culmination of over a decade of sacrifice. He'd made senior partner, would be earning well into 6 figures, had achieved the career success he'd been chasing since they married. Jennifer waited for relief, for David to finally have space to focus on their marriage. Instead, his new role demanded even more time. He was mentoring junior architects now, taking on bigger projects, traveling internationally. "I thought this would change things," Jennifer said one night, watching David pack for another business trip. "I thought once you made partner, you'd have more flexibility." David sighed, frustrated that she didn't understand. "This is when the real work begins," he said. "I have to prove I deserve this role." The promise he'd made to prioritize their relationship after achieving career stability had been forgotten, or revised, or perhaps never really meant at all. Jennifer turned 39 and realized she'd probably never be a mother. The window was closing, and David still wasn't ready. She grieved the children they'd never have, the family she'd imagined when writing her wedding vows. That version of their future had been written in vanishing ink, she realized. David had promised to build a life with her, but the life he'd built was for himself, with Jennifer as supporting character, rather than co-creator. Year 14 brought the affair. Not Jennifer's or David's. They were both too tired for affairs. But Jennifer's best friend from law school confessed to having an affair with a colleague, said her marriage had been dead for years. Jennifer listened and recognized elements of her own relationship in the description. The lack of intimacy, the parallel lives, the comfortable numbness. "At least have an affair or get divorced," her friend said. Don't just exist in this limbo forever. The comment haunted Jennifer. Was that what they were doing? Existing in limbo, honoring the form of marriage while abandoning its substance? She looked at David that evening, really looked at him for the first time in months. He was handsome still, successful, objectively a good man. But he wasn't her partner anymore. He was her roommate, her financial co-manager, the person she split household duties with. The promises they'd made to each other had faded so gradually, neither had noticed until nothing remained. She asked David if he was happy. He looked up from his laptop, surprised by the question. "Sure," he said. "I mean, life is good. Career's going well. We're financially stable. No major problems." That was the issue right there. He measured their marriage by absence of major problems rather than presence of joy, connection, growth. They'd both abandoned the promises they'd made without ever consciously deciding to. The vows had just evaporated. "I think we should separate," Jennifer said. The words felt surreal even as she spoke them. They'd been married 14 years. They'd promised forever. But forever had been written in vanishing ink, and she was done pretending she could still read what had faded away. David stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "What? Why? We're fine." That word, fine, crystallized everything wrong with their marriage. They weren't fighting or cheating or actively hurting each other. They were just fine, which was nowhere near what they'd promised to be. Jennifer tried to explain, but David couldn't hear it. To him, the marriage was succeeding by virtue of still existing. The idea that success required more than just persistence was foreign to his understanding. They tried another round of therapy, more intensive this time. The therapist asked them to describe their wedding vows, what they'd promised each other. Jennifer cried as she recounted her promises, to support David's dreams, to build a family, to choose him every day. "Did you keep those promises?" the therapist asked. Jennifer had kept some, failed at others. David had kept some, failed at others. They'd both let the promises fade like morning mist under afternoon sun. "Can you recommit?" the therapist asked. "Can you make new vows, knowing what you know now about yourselves and marriage?" They tried. They really tried. Went on a weekend retreat, just the two of them, and attempted to reconnect. But the gap between who they'd been and who they'd become was too wide. They'd built separate lives so completely that merging them back together felt impossible. Year 15 was their last year married. They told their families in the spring, filed papers in the summer, finalized the divorce in the fall. Their friends were shocked. Jennifer and David had seemed so stable, so committed. The irony wasn't lost on Jennifer. They'd seemed committed because they were good at going through motions, at maintaining appearances. But commitment without connection is just obligation, and obligation alone couldn't sustain a marriage. The divorce was amicable, almost painfully so. They divided assets fairly, stayed cordial, even hugged when signing final papers. No affairs to blame, no financial betrayals, no dramatic final fights. Just two people acknowledging that the promises they'd made at 27 and 29 had faded completely, and neither had the energy to rewrite them. The vows had been written in vanishing ink, and trying to trace what had disappeared was impossible. Jennifer's mother cried, said she'd thought they'd make it. "We all thought you'd make it," she said. Jennifer understood. On paper, they'd had everything: stable careers, financial security, no major conflicts. But marriage required more than absence of disaster. It required presence, attention, the daily choice to honor promises made. And both of them had stopped choosing, stopped honoring, stopped trying without ever consciously deciding to quit. David moved into a condo downtown, closer to work. Jennifer kept the house, finally decorated it the way she'd always wanted without negotiating with David's minimalist preferences. They spoke occasionally, friendly but distant. Sometimes Jennifer wondered if they'd divorced too easily, if they should have fought harder. But fighting required caring deeply, and she'd stopped caring deeply years before. The divorce just made official what had been true for a long time. A year after the divorce was finalized, Jennifer ran into one of their wedding guests at a coffee shop. "I'm so sorry about you and David," the woman said. "Your wedding was so beautiful." "We all thought you'd go the distance." Jennifer thanked her, but thought about those words later. Beautiful weddings didn't predict lasting marriages. Sincere vows didn't guarantee they'd be honored. The promises made in church that June afternoon had been real and meaningful, and completely temporary. She dated occasionally, cautiously, learned that she wanted different things now than she'd wanted at 27. Wanted someone who'd show up daily, not just in crisis. Wanted someone who measured success by connection rather than accomplishment. Wanted someone who understood that vows required renewal, that promises needed tending or they'd fade away. She was more realistic now, less romantic. It felt like loss and wisdom simultaneously. David got remarried 3 years after their divorce, to a colleague who shared his workaholic tendencies. Jennifer sent a gift, genuinely hoped he'd be happy. She wondered if he'd keep those new vows better than he'd kept the ones he'd made to her. Or maybe he'd keep them the same way. With sincerity at first, then with gradual abandonment as other priorities took precedence. Maybe he was capable of different. Or maybe this was just who he'd become. Jennifer stayed single longer, then eventually met someone through a friend. Someone divorced like her, carrying similar lessons about what it took to sustain partnership. They dated slowly, carefully, making no grand promises. When they did eventually marry, their vows were simpler, more honest. No promises about forever, just promises about showing up, about choosing each other consciously, about saying something when the ink started fading. She thought sometimes about her first wedding, about the hopeful young woman in the white dress making promises she believed she'd keep forever. Jennifer didn't judge that younger self harshly anymore. "27-year-old Jennifer had been sincere, had meant every word. She just hadn't known that meaning something wasn't the same as doing something, that good intentions faded without consistent action. The vows had been written in vanishing ink, not because Jennifer and David were bad people, but because they'd never learned to trace over them, to renew them, to keep them visible through daily choice and effort. The house on Maple Street where she'd lived with David eventually sold to a young couple in their 20s. Jennifer saw their wedding announcement online. They looked radiant, certain, full of promises. She hoped they'd keep their vows, that they'd be lucky or wise or committed enough to make permanence from promises. But she also knew the statistics, knew how many wedding vows eventually faded. Not from malice or betrayal, but from simple neglect, from the grinding pressure of ordinary life. On what would have been her 20th wedding anniversary, Jennifer thought about David, wondered if he remembered the date. Probably not. He'd made new memories now, new promises to a different person. She didn't feel bitter about it anymore, just reflective. Their marriage had taught her that love alone wasn't enough, that even sincere promises needed maintenance and attention and daily renewal. That vows written once couldn't sustain a lifetime unless you kept tracing over them, kept them visible, kept them meaningful through action. The real lesson, she'd learned, was that vanishing ink isn't tragedy if you notice it fading. The tragedy comes from pretending you can still read what's disappeared, from honoring the memory of vows rather than their substance. Jennifer and David had spent years honoring memory while the substance dissolved. By the time they admitted the words had faded, there was nothing left to renew. They'd lost not just their marriage, but the chance to save it, simply by refusing to acknowledge how much had already vanished. Thank you for journeying with me through Jennifer and David's story of promises that faded. Their experience reflects something so many couples face, not dramatic betrayal, but quiet abandonment of commitments made with complete sincerity. If this chronicle resonated with you, if you've watched vows fade in your own life, or recognized the slow erosion of promises once carved in stone, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to our channel and become a member of our community. Your support allows me to continue sharing these honest stories about marriage and commitment, about the gap between intention and action, about how we learn too late that vows require daily renewal. Together, we build understanding that permanent marker doesn't exist in relationships. We're all writing in vanishing ink, and the only question is whether we're willing to trace over the lines before they disappear completely. Until next time, may you notice when the ink starts fading, while there's still something left to renew.